So, after the rather controversial response to Series 3 from Wilbur Awdry, Brit and the rest of the production company decided to go to a back-to-basics approach when making stories for the show, going back to only adapting Railway series stories to bring them to TV. That's probably the safest option they could have gone for, because as much as I loved the original stories in Series 3, Wilbur's outrage didn't give them a good image to the general public.
This was not only the last time the classic series would adapt Railway series stories, but it would be the last released before Wilbur Awdry's death in 1997, caused by bronchopneumonia, a disease that affects breathing, and after being bedridden for quite a few years suffering from osteoporosis, a disease that weakens bones. Series 4 was broadcast in 1995, but 8 of the 26 episodes were first released straight to VHS in 1994. How did it compare to the previous series?
Well, this along with Series 5 are both considered favourites among people in the fandom, considered to be the peak of the entire classic series. But I'll say it's my second favourite because, while personally I think there's a lot that it does better than Series 3, there are some things that hold it back, a lot more than people let on.
I'll start by making a change to the format of my review only for this series by first talking about episodes 1 to 14. You will soon see why in a bit. What we get to see here is a different perspective on the show, as we get to see the first adapted Railway series stories on the narrow gauge engines on the Skarloey Railway. What is this railway, you might ask? Well, in between books taking place with the bigger engines, there were books focusing on a miniature railway of small engines. The model team, I'm guessing with a limited budget, chose not to worry about adapting stories of engines from an almost completely different railway, and wisely chose to focus on the mainline railway Thomas and the rest of the engines are set on. Now, with money to spend, they made Series 4 the TV debut of these little guys, and the results were fantastic. It's almost like we're watching a completely different show whilst sticking to the same universe, featuring the occasional appearance of characters we already know. Mainly Thomas because title character priorities, but only brief appearances, aside from when he is supposedly the one telling the stories Grandpuff, Sleeping Beauty and Bulldog. Speaking of those stories specifically, there are only 2 of the narrow gauge stories that are told out of order. Sleeping Beauty is told immediately after Grandpuff instead of after Bulldog and You Can't Win like it was in the book. My guess is that was done to get the happy ending of Duke getting rescued, otherwise some viewers, mainly the younger crowd, would become traumatised if they never found out if he was saved or not as soon as possible. And weirdly, so is Four Little Engines, where we see Sir Handel and Peter Sam are already established to be working on the railway, but then in the next episode, A Bad Day for Sir Handel, is when Skarloey first meets Sir Handel and Peter Sam.
Okay.
Ah well, at least they didn't wait an entire series to adapt these stories or leave them out entirely. To talk about Grandpuff and Sleeping Beauty specifically, never before has the show ever adapted such a tragic story in the form of the old narrow gauge railway with Duke as well as Sir Handel and Peter Sam when their names were originally Stuart and Falcon. Not only giving us a brief, very dark story where an engine called Smudger acts too recklessly at his work and is turned into a generator, never to move again, but their railway after staying in business for many years is closed. Stuart and Falcon are bought and get taken to Skarloey and Rheneas' railway, where they also get given new names, but Duke is left behind because nobody wanted to buy him, thinking he was too old. Duke is left alone in his shed and he sleeps to pass the time. Winter torrents wash soil over the shed and cause trees and bushes to hide his shed from ever being found. Even though, again, we do find out he made it out, that doesn't lessen the tragedy and sorrow that comes from the story before it. Such a well-written, mature story adapted brilliantly, as are the other narrow gauge stories, home to some very mature stories whilst remembering to have a laugh every now and again. The only sort of flump being Passengers and Polish, where the plot of Duncan complaining about not being polished does drag a little bit, but never did it ever feel tedious to watch. The appearance of the other bigger engines never feel like a pointless tie-in to the other railway. They are all working on the same railway under the same controller, don't forget, so it makes sense that their trains would be linked with each other. It also makes for some nice character interactions. I love Sir Handel's interaction with Gordon in A Bad Day for Sir Handel, where despite being clearly much smaller than him, he acts just as pompous and boastful as the big blue engine, if not more, to a point where when he stops boasting and goes away with his train, even Gordon can't process what just happened.
Gordon was speechless.
Priceless.
After all that praise I've just given the first 14 stories, taking up just over half of Series 4, it's fairly easy to say that Series 4 is overall consistently amazing, and it is. But then episode 15, Rusty to the Rescue, happens, and very suddenly, that Pepsi that you ordered from the bar starts to run a bit flat.
This is the only non-Railway series story in Series 4, and is written completely by Britt and David as a retcon of the introduction to Stepney the Bluebell engine. In the book of the same name, Percy tells Douglas about how engines nowadays are starting to be scrapped, much to his dismay. He talks about the Bluebell Railway, another real-life influence of the railway of the same name, that dedicates itself to preserving steam engines before they can be scrapped. And in real life, the first engine they saved from scrap was indeed Stepney. And not to say that the series isn't already known for making massive changes when adapting the book's stories, but they massively changed this in the show. Firstly, they make it so that the Bluebell Railway isn't a railway that saves engines, but is instead a part of the narrow gauge and standard gauge line that runs through the meadows that in springtime are filled with bluebell flowers that Rusty likes to travel through. Note how Thomas also runs down the line, I'll get back to that in a bit. One day, his driver says that an engine is needed to run the short railway. So Rusty, get this, gets the idea to go and find an engine in the same place that Douglas found Oliver, on the other railway. But that doesn't make any sense, right? The Skarloey Railway is miles from the crossing from Sodor to England. Logically, there couldn't possibly be a narrow gauge line leading all the way there. That would be almost longer than their own railway. Surely it doesn't exist. Does it? Yep, it does.
It took them all of the next day to travel to the other railway.
I'm not bloody surprised. So Rusty makes it to the railway but encounters some intimidating diesels on the other railway, some of which are apparently Mavis, Boko and Daisy. Yeah, alright mate. They find Stepney in the yards, get him working again, leave the yard without any yard manager trying to stop them like with Douglas, Oliver and Toad in Escape, and cross back to Sodor in what is admittedly a very beautiful shot.
We've done it! We're over the border and back on our own railway. Mission accomplished.
This retcon, while incredibly unrealistic, would have been alright if they didn't then retcon their retcon in the next episode, Thomas and Stepney. Percy tells Thomas about Stepney but says that his railway is really far away.
His name's Stepney. He's far away, but the Fat Controller says he may visit us. When? Oh, someday.
Despite the fact that Rusty works on his line, but also forgets Thomas passed through that station in the last episode. So they can't even stay consistent with their retcons. So after all the Stepney stories of when he comes to visit Sodor, which are, aside from the retcon, very well made, this was the point I think where the production team had no idea what to do with the last few spaces for episodes, so pulled a bunch of random ones that they didn't do in the previous series. Completely messing up the story order, which I have already talked about millions of times in the past, so I won't mention it again, but it's still a problem. But then, Jesus. But then you notice after 14 narrow gauge stories and 9 big engine stories, all written by Wilbert, mostly, that leaves 3 stories left for the 26 episode count. Who wrote those stories, you ask? Christopher Awdry. Look, I have nothing against the guy, but even though I never grew up with his books, I have seen a lot of them adapted from fan adaptations, mainly from Bluebell's 5529, whose videos I highly recommend. You can really tell that as soon as Chris takes the role of author, the ideas for stories start to run a bit thin. The episode Fish, while it is visually and musically gorgeous, is a story that just exists. Special Attraction just feels like two underdeveloped Railway series stories slapped together that, while it has an awesome crash, also just kind of exists. And the last story, my god, the last story. What is supposed to be the story that closes off Series 4. A series that, for the most part, has bedazzled us with fantastic stories from the Skarloey Railway, and some great stories from the mainline railway, closes off with Mind That Bike. A story where a postman loses his van because of cost cutting, gets a bike, Percy accidentally runs over it, and so he gets a new van.
So I did help Beam Percy. But by accident, as you might say.
And that's it! That's how they chose to end this? Really? Look, the Christmas stories in Series 1, 2 and 3 varied in quality, but all felt like heartwarming and conclusive ends to that particular series. Even Thomas and Percy's Christmas Adventure, despite being mostly about the characters whose names are in the episode title, still had the inclusion of Terence, Harold and Toby helping out to save the mountain village, and had that shot at the end with most of the engines together in the redecorated shed with the Christmas tree, so it too felt conclusive. Mind That Bike is by no means a bad story, but it feels so underwhelming as the supposed ending to Series 4. Paint Pots and Queens, I believe, would have been the perfect ending to this series. Yes, I know I have a continuity problem with it, but it's still a very nice story of all the engines working together to get the station ready for the Queen's visit. Everyone is there, everyone contributes, and it all feels wholesome, funny, and grand. Imagine this order of episodes put you through every other story before this one, and ended with the engines in a big, magnificent celebration with that brilliant final line.
No engines ever felt prouder than those on the Fat Controller's Railway.
That would have been so much better. So to conclude, Series 4 has a fantastic start and keeps that way through the first half and a bit. Then it has a great continuation for most of the second half, if somewhat lacking in consistency with Stepney and its continuity, and then has a good but heavily anticlimactic end with the last three stories. The second half is unfortunately what let Series 4 down slightly, but man oh man, that first half was amazing. It delivers on the goods, but overall has setbacks. So, onto the characters, because there is obviously a lot of newbies to get through, mainly to do with the narrow gauge engines. Like the bigger engines, they are not standouts purely for their paint jobs. Skarloey and Rheneas are the old, wise, determined workers willing to go through broken springs and jammed valve gears to bring their trains back home, and aren't afraid to tell others off for being silly. Sahandel is the pompous boaster who likes to hold himself in a position higher than he really is, which leads to his downfalls on multiple occasions. Peter Sam is the polite friend who is eager to work, maybe sometimes a little too eager, which makes him lose concentration. Rusty is the kind friend who gets on with whatever job he's given without complaining, but does not stand for others being rude or cheeky to him on some occasions. Duke carries the role of a father figure to Stuart and Falcon in their stories on the old railway. He's not afraid to put them in their place if they try and play a joke on him, but if they are ever in trouble, he will not rest until they are safe and sound. Even in situations where everything seems against him, he does not give up on hope, and it's what keeps him at peace, waiting for someone to come and save him and bring him home. What a unit. Duncan? Well, I think this compilation of his constant complaining paints a picture better than I ever could.
I'm a plain blunt engine, I speak as I find. I know my way about. I don't need smelly diesels to tell me what to do. Sleepers and ballast. I'm off. Peter Sam gets a special funnel, Sahandel gets special wheels, passengers get ices, but I'm not even polished. I get no rest, I get no rest. You always think about the passengers and never about me. I'm overworked and I won't stand it.
He's my favourite, he's so funny. Along with the narrow gauge characters, we've also got some new bigger engines and road vehicles. Most of these characters only have one story to their name in this, so it'll be easy to talk about them. George the Steamroller, another standard road vehicle hates the railway type character, who while his story of trying to one-up Sir Handel is good, feels like a lesser version of Bulgy. Caroline the car has a fun chase episode with Stepney and has a memorable character of old and worn out while being pushed beyond her speed limits, just not too memorable as she shares no interaction with anyone other than just talking to herself. The unnamed diesel in the episode Bowled Out, later named Class 40, is a typical snobby diesel who holds himself in a position above the engines and then later gets embarrassed when he breaks down. He's a passable character. Wish he had a name though.
I think I'll call him Bob. Moments later, Bob is dismembered.
Scruffy, the first truck to be given a name and a leader role to the other trucks, actually isn't that complex and is just another troublesome truck. Though I feel like it wasn't supposed to be anything more, so overall he's alright. Bulstrode I think was an underutilised character, a bad-tempered, disagreeable barge who is so annoying, even the trucks couldn't stand him, to a point when Percy finally arrives, they actually use manners for the first time just to ask Percy to help them get rid of him.
Please, put us in a siding so that we can load him up and be rid of him.
It's a shame as soon as he got a hole in his hull, he was just left on the beach and used as a children's play area. I feel like there's more potential than what is led on here. Now we come to the main newbie himself, Stepney the Bluebell Engine. His 4-part story, while it has a frustratingly confusing retcon, is one of the most memorable parts of Series 4, besides the narrow gauge engines, mainly because Stepney is given so many layers of character. He is always grateful whatever job he is given and always looks for chances to go on long journeys. He even enjoys pulling goods trains, much to the other engine's surprise. I think, while they don't share as much interaction on screen as in the books, there's a nice little dynamic with him and Duck. They shunt together on Stepney's the first day, and then on his last day, when Class 40 breaks down, they double-head his train to the big station in one of the series' most iconic spectacles with a nice musical arrangement. I really would have liked to have seen more of their friendship in the show, but I'm happy with what we got. Stepney is definitely my favourite of the new bigger engines introduced. Like Series 3, there isn't any characters that I think are my favourites of the whole series, as while some are better than others, no character steals the spotlight or stains the series. They're all just great. Even the one-dimensional one-off characters I don't hate or dislike, they're just kinda there. I can safely say that the Series 4 sets and music are the peak of the classic series, which is going to sound confusing given that I said in the Series 3 review that those sets were my favourite, but that's exactly it. The Series 4 production is the best, but Series 3 is my personal favourite. To borrow a memed quote,
"This is brilliant, but I like this."
The colours aren't as bold as before, but are instead very warm and gentle, with lighting that gives the energies fuzzy shadows in the day and evening shots, and striking silhouettes in the nighttime shots. It almost makes the set designs look magical.
We are not there yet. Wait your fucking turn. Thank you.
I can't think of any better way to explain it other than give you a list of the episodes I think best display the set design, so I highly encourage you to watch either Grandpuff, Sleeping Beauty, Bulldog, Four Little Engines, Special Funnel, Gallant Old Engine, Rusty to the Rescue, Thomas and Stepney, Bowled Out, Paint Pots and Queens, or Fish to get a better understanding of how gorgeous these sets are. I know this is me being lazy, but there's honestly no better way I can describe it. The same can also be said for the music. The reoccurring theme for the Skarloey Railway is the most iconic song to come from Series 4. It can be played in any situation for when the engines are working, whether it's an upbeat journey, a cross journey, or a sad journey, emphasising the raw beauty of the line that the engines run in despite being so small as they travel high into the mountains, out into the open valleys, or deep into the forests. Such a wondrous theme. Other highlights are the jovial and friendly Stepney's theme, the triumphant redemption of Oliver's theme in Toad Stands By, the grandiose marvel of the Queen's train gliding into the station, and the whimsy of Henry's theme in Fish as he pulls the flying kipper. Series 3 is still my favourite, but this is peak classic Thomas sound and design. For the production standouts, I actually found it hard to spot any reused shots in this series. Oh, there were definitely some, don't get me wrong, mainly reusing shots from previous episodes. Perhaps most infamously, Paint Pots and Queens reusing shots from Series 1 stories as if they just happened. But nope, not that many as far as I was aware. While there is an upside to the series, it comes at the cost of continuity. with the lines that were supposedly only accessible on Duke's old railway before it closed, that are also seen as part of the Skarloey Railway? Very weird if you ask me, but if that's what had to be done to avoid as much reused shots as possible, then I'll give them a pass on this. There's also a problem mainly with the bigger engines, where for some strange reason their whistles are all mixed up. Here are some examples.
Good night.
I don't know if someone wanted to introduce new whistles to the characters, or someone in the production office lost the sound files or something, but either way I just found that a bit weird. What is also a problem in Series 4, which is a noticeable problem I haven't mentioned with the previous series, is the engines wearing each other's faces. That would sound so horrifying in any other situation. But here are the examples. Thankfully, like with the whistle problem in Series 4, they aren't major issues and actually disappear off screen as soon as they're spotted, but are again something that needed to be pointed out. There's also several other songs and music videos made for Series 4 compared to just the one in Series 3, that also use deleted scenes from this series and the previous ones too. One of these music videos for the song Rules and Regulations is said to have debuted on a VHS tape in the UK, but I can't find it anywhere. And the music video for the song That's What Friends Are For only exists in fan uploads on YouTube from other hard to find VHS tapes. The rest are available everywhere you look, either on the official Thomas and Friends YouTube channel or lyric uploads by fans. Only downside being that the end of those official YouTube channel versions are followed by... And I'm not going to lie, a lot of these songs are nice to listen to. Yeah, I once again prefer the covers of most of these songs done by Headmaster Hastings, but that doesn't change that these are good songs. Also, just to give it a brief mention, there is also an early VHS release of some of the Series 4 episodes, but there's not that much to talk about compared to the Series 3 early dubs. They are literally the same narration tapes, with the only difference being the missing music cues and Michael Angelis' breathing that wasn't cut out. I for one think the whole series needs to be released just for this feature. Hashtag release the breathing Angelis cut. I'm only half joking with that one. Now then, on to my top 5 episodes.
Once again, so many to mention that were so close to making the list, but I didn't want to make this video too long. So, like with the Series 3 review, here they are very quickly.
Rock and roll. Out of all the narrow gauge engines, my favourites would have to be Duncan and Rusty, as I believe those two share a great dynamic. Rock and roll is their only episode together, but also their best. Duncan acts very rude to Rusty when he gives him a word of warning about unsafe tracks, and instead of just brushing it off, Rusty is understandably hurt by his words. So when Duncan later comes off the rails for not listening to his advice, he refuses to go and help him. It's only when Skarloey snaps at him for not taking the passengers into consideration that he does the right thing and sets off to the rescue. All the while, Duncan is stood there derailed, where all he can do is think about how silly he's been. So when he's eventually lifted back onto the line, he goes to Rusty and the conversation they have is just so sweet.
Rusty, he whispered, thank you for helping. I'm sorry I was rude to you. That's all right, Duncan. I wish all diesels were like you. Let's be friends. Suits me, replied Rusty. We'll mend that bad bit of rail first thing tomorrow.
That just warms my heart. Fish. Like Wrong Road, I'm choosing this story purely on its production values, as the story itself, as I said before, isn't that eventful, but boy oh boy does the production more than make up for that. This, I think, is the one episode of the classic series where the vast majority of it is shot at night. From the opening shots of Sodor at night with those iconic opening lines from Angelis, you know you're in for a visual beauty. On top of that, the sound design is definitely at its peak here. To point out something that the Unlucky Tug pointed out in his video essay of this episode, there is one shot where Henry leaves the harbour with the flying kipper with little to no music over it and no interruption from the narrator. We just sit back and take in the heavy sounds of a big metal machine pulling a heavy goods train along, and it is so satisfying. Phenomenal. Gallant old engine. Series 2 had Edward's exploit, Series 3 had Percy's promise, and here we have Gallant old engine. The tale of when Skarloey and Rheneas had to run their line by themselves the year before Sir Handel and Peter Sam joined. One stormy day, Rheneas has to take a full passenger train home, where there is even passengers in the brake van. At one point, his valve gear jams on one side, causing him to stop in the middle of nowhere, but with the support and encouragement from his driver and fireman, he continues on as best he can. When he eventually does make it home, there's a huge sense of pride that we feel towards him. I still love Edward's exploit more as a story of an engine overcoming an injury to get the train home, but this one is fantastic as well. For an engine that supposedly pushed himself so far beyond his limits that, quote-unquote, everything blurred, Rheneas really is one of the most underutilised narrow-gauge characters of the entire show, and worthy of praise in this story. Special funnel. To borrow once again from the Unlucky Tug, this episode has a very simple premise. Peter Sam has a broken funnel from an accident he had with some trucks and needs to get a new one, but like Fish and Wrong Road, this easy to follow simple story is made even better with the absolutely drop-dead gorgeous spectacle of the sets. As winter goes on, there's fog, ever-increasing winter winds, and heavy rain that turns streams into torrents, one of which completely washes away a track bed crossing the river. Then, as a new one is put in place, the weather becomes less foggy and snowier and frostier, coating the railway in a magical winter wonderland, causing icicles to form in a tunnel that hits Peter Sam's funnel, finally causing it to fall off. Once again, a very basic story, but I've already gone on enough about how pretty it is. Grandpuff and Sleeping Beauty. I mean, come on, it had to be these episodes. I did an entire synthwave music video tribute with these stories for a reason. While I also really like Bulldog and You Can't Win, it's these two I adore. Since I talked about these stories already, I'll refrain from repeating myself. I will say that they are without a doubt the peak of Series 4 and tell a story that is the most tragic and sorrowful that the show has ever tried to tell. The fact that they had the balls to show an engine being left in a shed only for it to be buried by nature is really commendable for how they never played down to kids. It always has been the best story of Series 4, and it always will be. Series 4 is an icon to the classic series, but more so in its production than its stories. While the first half and a bit is fantastic and well made for introducing a whole new railway to the island of Sodor, the second half lets it down with its inconsistent retcons, confusing story order, and the uneventful Christopher stories. But again, with just how beautiful this series manages to look, with very few technical problems compared to the previous ones, it almost makes up for the second half, making Series 4, in my personal opinion, the second best of the classic series. It could have done better, so it's not as good as Series 3, but it's still goddamn brilliant.
So after Wilbert's death and the production team deciding not to adapt Railway series stories anymore, what direction would this take the series? Well, all will be revealed next time as we look into the wacky rollercoaster of adventures and scares of Series 5. So, I'll see you guys next time.